Okay, we finished now looking at a whole bunch of issues on contemporary challenges to the Scripture. And we've covered, just as a recap, remember that in Bibliology, to get our evangelical Protestant biblical theology, remember we've got to have, first of all, inspiration, revelation, and inerrancy. Because ultimately what we want is really to get a Bible that is clear, that we can understand, and actually has God's authority to command our conscience and bind our beliefs. So again, to recap, all those areas we covered with contemporary challenges, it's going to start with the fact that the Bible is inspired by God. It's theopneustos, it's God-breathed. God is the one who produced the words in the Bible. Hence, they carry divine authority. And so because of inspiration now, that is God's revelation to us. He has unveiled his will to us, and he has done it so that it is reliable and without error. So with that, we'll look at other attributes of Scripture like sufficiency and clarity. But once we have in the autographs this inspired text, we'll see again, remember the next steps is that, well, now we have to collect these. Which are the inspired books and which are not the inspired books? See, that's canonicity. So we're going to look at, in one of the next sections, I think it's two more, we're going to look at, after inspiration and inerrancy, the nature of proof and proof of inspiration and inerrancy. So in effect, we're going to look at what are the criteria for identifying an inspired book. Now, based on that and those types of proofs and the evidence for it, that actually is going to come back and be used as criteria for canonicity. Well, these books satisfy the criteria for proof of inspiration, and books like the Quran and the Book of Mormon do not. Well, once we have the right collection of inspired books, well, guess what? We don't have books that are 3,500 or 2,000 years old. So then we look at textual transmission, okay, or the copies that we have, and to say, look, the originals are inspired and inerrant, and the copies have to correspond to the originals for them to be useful for us. So we go through the area of textual criticism. And then finally, since I'm sure most of you are not fluent in ancient Greek and Hebrew, then what you have to do is, do we have a good translation that accurately represents the original languages? So, and then from there, we'll look at the last topic we look at is sola scriptura. As an evangelical Protestant university, we essentially say the Bible is the final say on every single matter that it addresses. But in addition to that, it's sufficient for our faith and it's clear. So once we're done with all of those topics and we give enough evidence for that, then we can start ultimately the systematic theology task. We have a source of knowledge that is sufficient, that is clear, and that is authoritative to build a system of doctrine. But so the overview of all the contemporary challenges address those areas of knowledge, of revelation, and so on and so forth that I just mentioned. But before we hit inspiration and inerrancy, now the way these courses are designed in Essential Christian Doctrine 1, 2, and our Scripture course here is that we've got a wealth of information here at Talbot School of Theology with other professors, Dr. Rob Price, Dr. Peterson, Dr. Sosi. So we're incorporating as much existing material into our course as we can, while still keeping our emphasis here on this is Essential Christian Doctrine, polemical and elenctic theology. So Dr. Price is going to have a series of videos explaining the interpretation of Scripture. Now, what that means, though, is that, this is what we call hermeneutics and exegesis. You're going to have an entire course on biblical hermeneutics, and for those of you who go on, you'll actually study languages and exegetical method and so on and so forth. But again, to get to theology from the Bible, what do we have to do? We have to interpret it properly. As I mentioned in the contemporary challenges, when we get to interpretation, we don't want, for example, interpretations disguised as translations, like the New World Translation. What you have are Jehovah's Witness leaders made it up as they went and then called it a Bible translation. Or proper method for interpreting the Bible isn't Kenneth Copeland and some of the Word Faith teachers' idea of revelation knowledge. And then there's other critical theories and others, but what we do and what we have practiced traditionally as conservative Protestant evangelicals is the idea of a grammatical historical mode of exegesis and interpretation of Scripture. Now, briefly on that, because Dr. Price is going to give a whole bunch of information on this, and you're going to have a hermeneutics course on this, is that ultimately grammatical historical simply means that beginning with the idea that the Bible is accurate and true, we have verbal plenary inspiration. Every word in the Bible is true. It's accurate and is sufficient. But what we've got, though, is that our job, when God revealed it and inspired the human authors 2,000 to 3,500 years ago, is the fact is we have to look at the historical cultural context of how the words are used. Okay, so we look at the words, the grammar, in the historical, cultural, theological context, and from there, we gather what the original meaning, the authorial intent of the author is, and from our exegesis and interpretive principles, we draw out these authoritative propositions to use for theology. Because ultimately, if we do not do it that way, we've got an authoritative Bible, but we're not drawing out the meaning of those propositions and using them, then it's no longer the final authority of the Bible and ultimately God through the Scriptures. So this is why we need a proper mode of exegesis. So grammatical, historical, which ultimately leads to this, because this is important, because remember, we're getting to the concept of authority, the rule of faith. The concept of the rule of faith, which ends up in doctrinal statements, really means that there's an authority that governs our belief. So the idea that we have these fixed authoritative propositions that we draw out is necessary for us to maintain a proper biblical rule of faith. Because otherwise, we don't have a rule of God or rule of faith through Scripture as the noetic foundation of the faith. Instead, it's the rule of pastors, it's the rule of councils, it's the rule of something else. So this is why when we think about the issue of interpretation, it's just vital after we've got all these issues in place where we get to an inspired, inerrant, authoritative, knowable, reliable text, we got to interpret it properly. And again, Dr. Price and your hermeneutics class, we're going to cover a lot of these principles. So what you need to do, like with the rule of faith, we want God to govern our beliefs, not eisegete or read in our beliefs or somebody else's beliefs into the Bible. We have the same contemporary problem in the legal system. You have the debate in the courts on what's called originalism, which is ultimately a grammatical, historical hermeneutic. Do we look at what the original meaning is of these constitutional principles? Because if not, you don't have a rule of law, you have a rule of judges. Okay? And what we want is a fixed objective rule of law, just like we need a fixed objective rule of faith in the Scriptures. So that's why it's so significant that we actually, again, adopt not only the right view of inspiration and inerrancy and canonicity and so forth, but we have the right hermeneutical and exegetical method. Now, all of this, of course, I'm going to cover in later sessions, but this presumes a lot of things at this point, which are assumed in Protestant exegesis. Like, again, we're rejecting radical postmodernism and skepticism. The fact is that language is adequate to convey knowledge, that we actually have knowledge, and so on and so forth. So all of these are presumptions, and we'll explore a lot more of this in our discussion boards, in the other lectures. You'll also do this in your hermeneutics course, but ultimately what you want to do with all of this is make sure that you, as the servant of God, are clearly communicating God's ideas for law, gospel, salvation, and so forth, and not imputing or adding anybody else's, but you give God's message. Anyway, after this, Dr. Price is going to cover a number of things on the interpretation of Scripture. So anyway, we'll see you in the next module. Thanks.